Alternate presidents, because why not? Scenario 1. What if Ronald Reagan was elected in 1976? This is actually very possible because he very nearly unseated the sitting president, Gerald Ford, which would be kind of crazy to hear the first president in modern history to lose his own primary. We actually know quite a bit of what he would have done because he's very vocal. His vice president would have been Richard Schweiker, the senator from Pennsylvania, who he named as his running mate before he even got the nomination. He would eventually give him the role of health secretary. Schweiker was a liberal Republican to balance the ticket with conservative Reagan, and despite coming off the Nixon administration, Reagan is a very charismatic guy. So it would have been a tight election, but he probably still could have beat Jimmy Carter early. So of course he would have introduced Reaganomics early to cut taxes for the rich and hope the money will trickle down that they have more money to pay their employers, which of course doesn't work at all. Cutting taxes for the rich will only make them more rich and want to hoard more of their money and become richer. And of course people who have seen For All Mankind will know roughly what he would have done. He opposed the returning of the Panama Canal so America keeps it here, if a future president doesn't return it later. And the Camp David Accord probably either doesn't happen or just completely fails, so Israel still occupies the Sinai Peninsula. The Department of Education wouldn't have been founded, leaving education up to the states, which if you think that's a good thing, then you are definite evidence why this is not a good thing. Along with other Republican things, there's also very good evidence that Reagan wanted to enter the Rhodesian-Zimbabwe Bush War, sending aid to the white minority-ruled Rhodesia very soon after Vietnam, and the international community would absolutely despise this, but Reagan will try and sell it as a way to defend against communism in the Dark Continent. And after a few war crimes, the fighting will more or less end for a Rhodesian victory, just for America to get involved in the Angola Civil War for all you Call of Duty fans. Even in real life, Reagan wanted to go soft on apartheid South Africa and wanted to work with them to fight against communism. So the majority of Rhodesia's army away, this would probably also lead to a military coup by native Africans. Then another Rhodesian civil war, plus Angola, plus invasion of South Africa, when they have nukes at this point, so it would be this colossal disaster, and that's not even saying So Reagan probably would lose re-election in 1980 if this wasn't Ronald Reagan, who could sell literally anything, no matter how obviously bad it is, so he probably would win re-election, maybe against a poor showing by the Democrats. And then his second term would basically just be his real first term, along with an alternate version of Operation Just Cause to regime change in Panama, after they complained too much about the canal not returning. So that means in the election of 84 will be Democrat Gary Hart.
The special interests are fighting Gary Hart because this is the prize. When they carve it up, when the PACs, the lobbyists, and the boys in the back room get what they want, what will be left for you? Who pays the bill for all of those political promises? You do. Gary Hart has had the courage to say no to the special interests. That's leadership. Gary Hart, a new leader for America.
Hart was 48 and very popular, even with conservatives. He gained the nickname the Atari Democrat and later the Nintendo Democrat due to his dedication to technology and the free market.
I think we can meet the basic human needs and commitments of the people of this country by restoring entrepreneurship.
Now, for Hart's running mate, it really could have been anybody, like conservative Paul Simons, who looks like a nerd, progressive Jesse Jackson, or someone closer to Hart like Al Gore. And Gary Hart winning the election very narrowly, becoming the 40th president and the first one born in Kansas just in time for the 50th anniversary of Wizard of Oz.
I proposed a bill called the American Defense Education Act that would increase federal financial assistance to local school districts to increase teacher salaries and hire teachers. For this country to be number one in the 1980s and 90s, education must be the number one priority in this country.
As well as the founding of the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Chips and Science Act to fund science and microchip production domestically and federally ban smoking on airplanes. Hart would take the AIDS crisis serious, funding research and preventing many, many deaths. If the Department of Education doesn't exist yet, then Hart would definitely found it. And maybe another department would be founded after a man sold information to the Soviets and was exposed. from his ex-wife, and the founding of the Department of Homeland Security. The year also brought the banning of semi-automatic rifles. The AIDS Protection Act. Hart appointed the first 2 women to the Supreme Court, including the first Jewish person, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Minimum wage went up to $4 an hour. The ban on women combat pilots was lifted. He would meet with the Soviet premier for détente, and Hart returned to America to discover the press discovered his affair with White House aide Diana Rice. Now, in real life, he resigned his campaign after this was exposed, but let's say he continued on. Despite the polls showing a favorable outcome, and the average American really didn't care or just thought it was funny because he was doing so well as president, didn't care about his personal life, Republicans hammered him on this.
To strengthen the American family, to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons.
With Pat Robertson, the televangelist, running against Hart in '88, but because of how well the economy was doing, Hart ended up winning with an even bigger majority than he won in the last election. And he would have got some stuff done, like making Israel retreat from the Sinai, and the Gulf War is prevented. So with Reagan early, this basically meant we had a better Bill Clinton early, which of course means after Hart we had our George Bush equivalent being Bob Dole, who will also be the second president in a row from Kansas, selecting Colin Powell as the first African-American vice president. And thanks to that budget surplus from Gary Hart, they're going to spend that by invading Iraq. Most definitely also regime changing, and then invading Afghanistan. Cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Low subsidies, slower adoption of the internet, so many schools go without him longer. Attempting to ban porn and high gas prices would doom his campaign, leaving him a one-term president against Al Gore. But I'll save Al Gore for another time. Let's go back to Reagan. What if he was a little less lucky? This could work for an alternate for my first scenario, but either way, he gets elected in '80. He's a little less lucky, so a Jodie Foster simp ends up hitting him, making Reagan the second shortest serving president at a little over 2 months. Meaning George H.W. Bush becomes president early. For vice president, he could select someone conservative, like Bob Dole, or maybe someone more similar to himself, like his former election rival, John B. Anderson. Maybe even Shirley Temple Black if we want another celebrity. Bush would still attempt the Reaganomics, even if he didn't fully agree with them. But Bush is his own person, and he disagreed with Reagan on a lot of things, including media. So sadly, a lot of your 80s nostalgia franchises wouldn't or would be delayed.
Reagan deregulated the guidelines around advertising, believing that the free market should determine broadcasting content and that it's up to the parents to decide what a child is allowed to see. Thus, 80s cartoons became 30-minute advertisements for toys and video games, and most parents didn't do shit about it. Think Transformers, He-Man, My Little Pony, G.I. Joe, Captain N, a fucking Rubik's Cube? Many network cartoons of the 80s were accused of being either violent, brainless slop or ooey gooey cutesy, brainless slop. Nonetheless, ACT pushed the next administration into doing away with these serialized commercials, wrapped around serial commercials. The FCC, under George Herbert Walker Texas Ranger Bush, passed the Children's Television Act in 1990, which limited advertising to children and required the inclusion of educational content. Of course, the definition of educational was rather vague over the years. So, entering into this era of re-regulated children's programming, Fox knew that it couldn't rely on the old formula of colorful characters sell toys, which sells more show. That would come later. And instead, Margaret Loesch banked on the new trend of artist-led content. One of the pioneers of this trend had been Ralph Bakshi's Mighty Mouse, The New Adventures on CBS. Nickelodeon began production on Ren and Stimpy and Rugrats, which led to the era of Nicktoons. Cartoon Network, owned by Ted Turner, had bought the entire Hanna-Barbera catalog and introduced classic cartoons to younger viewers, while reintroducing adults to their childhood favorites.
Bush was also as hard an internationally focused guy. He would still fight communism, but instead of Reagan's 11, he would knock it down to a 5. And he's a far more cautious guy who was less focused at home, so the air traffic strike would lead to not everyone getting fired, but a prolonged negotiation, maybe even completely unable to solve it. And with the economy doing shit, and being uncharismatic to solve it, this results in him losing re-election in '84. to Walter Mondale. Scenario 3 can also go with the last one, or can just Reagan still president.
Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did.
That is something literally nobody wants to hear. No one likes taxes, so either he doesn't say that, or people will be like, well, at least he's honest.
Reagan's America, everyone is comfortable and everything is fine. But in the real America, the one he doesn't see, people have to take a second job just to get by. Millions have no job at all. Old people worry about paying medical bills. Parents about sending kids to college. In the real America, millions are still trying to make it and need a fair chance. Is America back, or can we do better? That's the debate. Mondale Ferraro, fighting for our future.
Leading to a narrow victory. And Walter Mondale becomes the first president from Minnesota. Also, another more significant first, Geraldine Ferraro becomes the first female vice president in American history, becoming incredibly inspirational for women in politics in the future. Mondale believed in progressive tax on the rich, but was also very slow and steady for reform, which in the short term didn't really do anything, but in the long term really paid off. So Black Monday would still hit, but to a far lesser degree. Mondale will actually do something about AIDS, unlike Reagan, and instead of a war on drugs, would be more willing to reform and expand rehab centers. He would take a very soft approach to the Soviets, seeking negotiations and détente, which means that there won't really be a major involvement in Nicaragua or Panama, and ironically putting stronger sanctions on South Africa because he believes strongly in civil rights. Conservatives will take this opportunity to display Mondale as being incredibly weak, doing anything to help the Soviets. But with a not great but above average economy, no new wars, and no scandals, this leads to the '88 election. Oh no! And the House votes to re-elect Walter Mondale. And in his second term, he definitely makes Puerto Rico a state. And the Gulf War doesn't happen. Mondale will go down in history as a progressive, yet pragmatic president that not a whole lot of people remember because he wasn't that, exciting, but he definitely did the job right. Geraldine will attempt to run in '92, but lose to Bob Dole. Maybe she'll return in '96. But a different scenario for '92, Jesse Jackson, after losing the last two nominations, finally gets it in '92, becoming the first African American to win a major party's nomination. JJ, the 51-year-old ultra-progressive, against the very old, out-of-touch George W. Bush, who's running with Dan Quayle, of all people. It was pretty easy to attack Bush. Plus, remembering the racist Willie Horton ad and lying about not raising new taxes. Well, Jackson was supported by what he called the Rainbow Coalition, uniting people of all colors, backgrounds, and creeds.
Got a long way to go, and we just get people who we can find them.
And maybe with some vote splitting from Ross Perot, this leads to Jesse Jackson becoming the first African-American president in American history, and the second from South Carolina if you count Andrew Jackson, with centrist Bill Clinton as his vice president.
Could I please have your... Nice titties. Could I please have your attention?
Jackson would attempt to do everything that Clinton did, while also being very progressive, like trying to decriminalize homosexuality and gay marriage. Also, Jackson is African American, so would have a very, very hard time to do anything. So Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution would hit even harder with a supermajority in the House and Senate, leading Jackson to being a lame duck president, which gets exploited by the next Republican nominee, David Duke, being the far-right rejection of Jackson, openly attacking Jackson to just racist degrees, claiming that he's responsible for the LA riots and O.J. Simpson going free, campaigning that they have to be tough on crime, they can't worry about people's feelings to make America great again. Selecting very similar to himself, Pat Buchanan, as his running mate, literally coined the term culture war, claiming America has to focus on itself more than its diverse equity and inclusion of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. Jesse attempts to counter that David Duke is quite literally the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, but no matter how much evidence about how evil these two are, just nothing seems to stick. And so Jackson loses in a landslide, and David Duke becomes the most conservative president in American history, denouncing equality and diversity as communism, increasing the war on drugs to strike supposed drug boats in the Caribbean Sea, as well as the Gulf of Mexico, which he attempted to rename the Gulf of America, gutted the Department of Education, and, well, just cut everything that wasn't military spending, in which he increased that, as well as cutting many safety regulations, pulled out NAFTA, gutted social programs, was so anti-immigrant he literally had them rounded up in camps. Despite campaigning against the idea of people being hired because they're diverse, he ended up hiring mostly incredibly incompetent people because they are white, or loyal to himself, who ended up doing a way worse job and spending way more money, denounced the Kyoto Protocols because profit matters more than the earth, rejected any gun reform because Duke thought that guns were more important than people, and with the economy doing completely awful, the media completely covering it up, what really brought him down was the fact that he was a tax evader. So the next election brought a Democrat who was pragmatic but progressive to fix everything the last administration completely fucked up. Texas Governor Ann Richards,
I commuted his sentence to dinner for two,
becoming the first female president in American history, with John Kerry as her vice president. But let me know down below, as well as hitting the like button, subscribing if you're new, and hype on mobile.